I matched with this guy named Mike on Tinder a little over a year ago. At first, everything seemed fine, pretty normal for the most part. We talked for a couple of weeks before meeting up, and he seemed like a genuinely nice guy. We both lived in Chicago, so it was easy to plan a few casual meetups. Our first date was at a coffee shop in Wicker Park, a cozy spot not too far from where I lived. The conversation was great. Mike was easy to talk to and seemed really interested in getting to know me. There wasn't any immediate red flag or anything that made me feel uncomfortable. After that, we met up a couple more times over the next few weeks. We went to a small bar near Logan Square, grabbed dinner downtown, and once even went for a walk by the lake near the Shed Aquarium. It felt normal, but I wasn't entirely sure if I was into him. There was no real spark, but I figured that happens sometimes, and I was still open to seeing where things went. He seemed like a decent guy, so I didn't see any harm in it. But then things started getting weird. One morning, I went to my regular grocery store, a Jewel Osco near my apartment, and I noticed Mike there. It seemed strange because we hadn't talked about our plans for the day, and I don't remember ever mentioning that I shopped there. He came up to me, acting like it was a total coincidence, and I played along, though I felt a bit off. Still, it's Chicago, right? Big city, but small world. I brushed it off as one of those random things. Not long after, maybe a week or two later, I saw him again. This time it was outside my gym in Lakeview. I hadn't told him which gym I went to, or even that I had a workout routine. It felt strange, but again, I rationalized it as just another weird coincidence. I mean, we did live in the same city, so it wasn't totally impossible for us to bump into each other. But I started feeling like maybe these coincidences weren't so random after all. The next time I saw him, it wasn't just unsettling, it was downright scary. I was leaving work late one evening. I work in a small office building in the West Loop. The sun had already set, and I was walking to my car parked a couple of blocks away. As I rounded the corner, I saw Mike. He was just standing there, not too far from my car. He didn't have any reason to be there. I hadn't told him where I worked, and there was no way he could have known. I didn't say anything to him, just gave a half-hearted wave, got into my car, and drove home. It was then that I started to feel like something was really wrong. He had no reason to know where I worked, let alone be standing near my car that late at night. The whole thing left me with this sinking feeling in my stomach, but I didn't know what to do about it. I hadn't seen him do anything explicitly threatening, but the constant appearances were unsettling to say the least. I stopped responding to his texts after that. I thought maybe if I put some distance between us, he'd take the hint and move on. But that's when things escalated. I started seeing him more frequently. Once I was out with friends at a restaurant in Lincoln Park, and there he was, sitting at a table near the window, just watching. He didn't come over to talk this time. He didn't even acknowledge me. He just sat there, occasionally glancing over in my direction. It was eerie. I left early that night, telling my friends I wasn't feeling well. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It wasn't just that I was seeing him everywhere, it was the way he was always just there. Like he was waiting for something, watching. Then came the night that really terrified me. I was driving home from a late shift at work, and as I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, I noticed a car behind me. It wasn't that unusual until I realized it had been behind me for quite a while, matching my turns and following me from several streets away. I couldn't see the driver clearly, but something about the way the car moved made my skin crawl. I parked and watched as the car slowed down, then sped off as I got out. I was shaking by the time I made it into my apartment. I checked my phone and saw a missed call from Mike, followed by a text saying he was in the neighborhood and thought he saw me driving. That's when I knew it was him following me. I felt sick. I blocked his number that night, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, I kept seeing him. At first, it was the same random spots, near my gym, outside the grocery store, on my street. I'd catch a glimpse of him across the road or in a nearby car, but he never approached me. It was like he wanted me to know he was there but didn't want to confront me directly. I started changing my routine, taking different routes to work, switching gyms, even avoiding some of my favorite spots in the city. But no matter what I did, I kept seeing him. Once I saw him standing outside my apartment building late at night. I watched him from my window, heart pounding in my chest. He just stood there looking up at the building, not moving, not doing anything. I didn't sleep that night. I was too scared to go to the police. I didn't have any solid proof that he was stalking me. Just a series of unsettling encounters that, when put together, painted a pretty disturbing picture. I confided in a close friend about everything that had been happening, and she was the one who finally convinced me to get some kind of help. She had actually seen Mike following my car one night after we'd hung out, which confirmed that I wasn't just being paranoid. I filed a police report a couple of days later, but there wasn't much they could do at that point. Without direct threats or physical harm, they said it would be difficult to pursue any legal action. They advised me to document everything, which I did, and to call them if he ever approached me again. That didn't exactly give me a lot of comfort, but at least I had something on record. After that, I didn't see him for a while. Weeks went by without any sign of him, and I started to feel like maybe it was over. Maybe he had finally moved on or found someone else to fixate on. I started going back to my normal routine, trying to shake off the lingering anxiety that had built up over the past few months. But then, out of nowhere, he reappeared. This time it was outside my office. I was leaving work late again, and as I walked toward my car, I saw him standing across the street just watching. He didn't say anything, didn't try to come over. He just stood there staring. I felt frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then I quickly got into my car and drove away, my heart racing the entire time. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the times I had seen him, the way he always seemed to be nearby, watching but never approaching. It felt like he was playing some kind of twisted game, and I was the unwilling participant. Every time I thought it was over, he would show up again, like he was reminding me that he hadn't forgotten about me. I started carrying pepper spray everywhere I went, just in case. I also made sure to let my friends and coworkers know what was going on, so they could keep an eye out for anything suspicious. I felt like I was constantly on edge, never able to fully relax, always waiting for the next time he would appear. Months have passed since then, and I haven't seen him recently. I'd like to think he's finally moved on, but there's a part of me that's always waiting for him to show up again. I matched with this girl Maria on Tinder a while back. I live in Denver, and she mentioned in one of our conversations that she was pretty close by, just a few neighborhoods away. She seemed normal, I guess. We talked for about a week before setting up a date, and everything was casual. She wasn't overly flirty or anything. It felt pretty standard, like talking to someone who could be cool to hang out with. She suggested that I come over to her place for dinner, which wasn't too weird to me. I'd been on a few Tinder dates before, and sometimes meeting at home felt easier. It was more comfortable than a crowded bar or restaurant, plus it saved on money. She gave me her address and told me to knock on the back door since her front doorbell was broken. The place was in a neighborhood I wasn't super familiar with, kind of in the southern part of the city, around Inglewood. I looked it up online before heading over. The street looked normal, pretty quiet. It was just one of those typical suburban streets with older homes, a few trees, nothing sketchy about it. So I didn't really think twice about the back door thing. The day of the date, I left my apartment around 6 p.m. It was late fall, so the sun had already started setting, but it wasn't completely dark yet. I remember thinking that I was a little nervous, but not for any particular reason. It was just that kind of nervous energy you get before meeting someone new. The drive over was uneventful, just the usual traffic for that time of evening. I had the radio on, just trying to keep my mind off the date. I wasn't expecting anything weird, and I definitely wasn't prepared for what happened. I got to the street, found the house number she gave me, and parked a little ways down. The house looked like it did in the Google Maps picture. It was a small, older bungalow with a fenced-in backyard. There was nothing out of the ordinary. I walked around to the back as she had asked, and when I got there, I noticed a few things that gave me pause. The backyard was kind of overgrown. weeds creeping up through the cracks in the patio, and there were no lights on inside. At that point, I should have just left. Something felt off, but I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe the lights were off because she was still getting ready or something. I knocked on the back door, like she said. There was a weird pause where nothing happened, and then the door opened slowly. A woman stood there, but she didn't look exactly like the Maria I'd seen in the pictures. It was strange, but the lighting wasn't great, so I thought maybe it was just the way the shadows were hitting her face. She smiled, but it was kind of off. Not a genuine smile, more like she was trying to convince me everything was fine. I asked if she was Maria, and she said she was. I tried to brush off my discomfort and stepped inside. The inside of the house was dark, way darker than I expected. There were a few dim lamps on, but not enough to light the whole place. As soon as I walked in, I got this overwhelming sense that I shouldn't be there. I couldn't place why, but the house felt wrong. There was no noise, no music playing, no TV in the background, nothing. Just dead silence. The air felt heavy, like the house hadn't been lived in for a while. I noticed right away that the furniture looked old, dusty even, as if no one had sat on it in a long time. I remember my heart starting to race a little, but I didn't want to be rude, so I tried to keep the conversation going, even though something was telling me to leave. She asked me to sit down while she finished up dinner. I didn't want to. Every part of me was screaming that I shouldn't sit down, that I shouldn't even be in that house, but I did it anyway, thinking I was just being paranoid. I sat on the edge of this old, sagging couch that smelled faintly of mildew. It was like the whole place had been left untouched for a long time. The cushions were stiff, and the air felt stale, like the windows had been shut for years. I couldn't shake this growing sense of dread, like I was being lured into something I didn't understand. The woman, who still insisted she was Maria, disappeared into the kitchen. I could hear her moving around, opening and closing cabinets, but there was no sound of food cooking or anything. That's when I started to panic. I glanced around the living room, and that's when I noticed that there were no personal touches anywhere. No pictures on the walls, no books or magazines, nothing that made it look like someone actually lived there. It was like the house was staged, like a set for a movie where people were supposed to live but didn't. My heart started beating faster, and I could feel the adrenaline kicking in. I knew I had to get out of there. I stood up, my eyes darting to the back door, and I started to make my way towards it. That's when she came back into the room, holding 2 plates. She was smiling, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. There was something predatory about the way she looked at me, like she knew I was about to leave. She asked me to stay for dinner, but I mumbled some excuse about having to leave early. I didn't even wait for her response. I just turned and headed for the door. As I stepped out into the backyard, I half expected her to follow me, but she didn't. I didn't look back. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. I practically ran to my car, heart pounding, and as soon as I got in, I locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had almost happened. My hands were shaking as I started the car, and I drove away as fast as I could, not looking back once. I drove around for a while, trying to process what had just happened. I kept thinking about how weird everything felt, how she didn't look like her pictures, how the house seemed abandoned, how she never really explained why everything was so off. By the time I got home, I was convinced that I had just narrowly avoided something dangerous. I checked my phone to see if she had messaged me, but there was nothing, not a single text or call. I opened Tinder to unmatch her, but her profile was gone, completely disappeared. It was like she had never existed. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was a scam. Maybe she was someone else entirely. I tried to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The whole thing just felt wrong. I never heard from her again, and honestly, I didn't want to. But a few days later, something else happened that freaked me out even more. I was at work, just going about my day, when I got a text from an unknown number. It was just an address. No context, no name, just an address. It looked familiar, and when I looked it up, my heart sank. It was the same house I had gone to for the date with Maria. My first thought was that she had somehow gotten my number, that maybe this was some sort of game or threat. I didn't respond, obviously, and I blocked the number right away. But the fact that whoever this was now had my number freaked me out more than anything else. I thought about going to the police, but what would I even tell them? That I went to some random house, met a woman who didn't seem right, and then got a text from a number I didn't recognize? It felt too vague, too weird to explain. And besides, I wasn't even sure what had really happened. I just knew that something was off, and I wanted to distance myself from it as much as possible. For the next few weeks, I was on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder. I stopped using Tinder altogether, deleted my account, and tried to move on. But every now and then, I'd get that uneasy feeling like someone was watching me or keeping tabs on where I was. I never went back to that part of town again, and I've been more careful about who I meet online since then. I still think about it sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep. I wonder who that woman really was, if she was even the person I'd been talking to in the first place. I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed for dinner, if I hadn't trusted my gut and left when I did. There's a part of me that's convinced I dodged something truly awful, but I'll never know for sure.
About a year ago, I met a guy named Dan on Tinder. I live in Portland, and we matched when I was scrolling one night out of boredom. His profile seemed pretty standard. He had a few pictures of himself hiking, a couple of shots with friends, and one where he was holding a camera. In his bio, he mentioned he was into photography, which didn't really stand out as anything weird. Portland's full of people into nature and artsy stuff, so it felt normal. We started chatting, and he came off as friendly. Nothing too intense, just casual conversations about our favorite spots in the city, good hiking trails, and places to grab coffee. After a week or so of chatting, we decided to meet up. Our first date was simple. We grabbed coffee at a small place near the Pearl District, one of those hipster cafes that Portland is known for. Dan seemed nice in person, a little quiet, but I figured he was just shy. He talked a lot about his photography, showing me some photos on his phone, mostly landscapes and city shots. The conversation flowed pretty easily, and I didn't feel any immediate red flags. He asked a lot of questions about me, my hobbies, and what I like to do around the city. It was the usual stuff you'd ask on a first date. We met up a few more times after that. Once for lunch, another time for a walk around the park, and one time for drinks. Nothing about him really stood out as weird or creepy. He wasn't overly flirty, didn't pressure me to do anything, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. I wouldn't say I was super into him, but I thought he was a decent guy, and I enjoyed hanging out with him. After a few dates, Dan started bringing up his photography more often, asking if I'd be interested in doing some casual photo shoots. He said he thought I had a unique look that would be great for his portfolio. I'm not a model by any means, and the idea of having someone take photos of me felt awkward. So I politely declined, telling him it wasn't really my thing. He seemed to take it well at first, saying he understood, but he kept bringing it up in our conversations. He would send me random photos from shoots he had done, trying to show me how tasteful his work was. Every time I would just brush it off or change the subject. It started to get uncomfortable when he wouldn't drop it. He kept asking more persistently, saying I should just try it, and that I'd look amazing in front of the camera. It was becoming the main thing he talked about whenever we texted or met up. I started feeling weird about it, like he wasn't respecting my boundaries. I thought about cutting things off, but I didn't want to seem rude or overreact, so I just kept making excuses and hoping he'd stop. One day, after I'd been dodging his requests for a while, I decided to block his number. I wasn't interested in seeing him anymore, and the whole photography thing was starting to feel too pushy. After I blocked him, I didn't think much about it. I figured he'd just move on, maybe find someone else to take pictures of. But that's when things got strange.
A few days later, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was blank and the body of the email contained only one thing: a photo of me. It wasn't one I had taken or posted anywhere. It was a candid shot of me sitting at a cafe, not even looking at the camera. I immediately felt a jolt of fear run through me. The email didn't have any text, just the photo. I couldn't figure out where or when it had been taken, but it was definitely me, sitting alone at a small table, sipping coffee. The more I looked at it, the more unsettled I became. The angle made it clear that I hadn't noticed someone taking the picture. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was some weird coincidence. But then, a couple of days later, I got another email. This time, it was a picture of me walking down the street near my apartment. Again, it was candid. I was looking down at my phone, completely unaware. My heart raced as I stared at the photo. I didn't know what to think. Someone had been following me, taking pictures without my knowledge. I didn't immediately connect it to Dan. I thought maybe it was some random creep or someone messing with me. But then I got a third email. This time it was a picture of me with Dan, taken from one of our dates. We were sitting together on a park bench, and the angle suggested it had been taken from a distance. That's when it clicked. These photos weren't just random. They were from the times I had been with Dan or near places we had gone together. It wasn't just a coincidence anymore. It was him. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized what was happening. Dan had been photographing me without my permission. I went back through our text messages, remembering how he had always brought up his photography, how insistent he had been. I had assumed he meant professional photos, but now it was clear he had been taking pictures of me all along, without me knowing. I didn't know what to do. I felt violated, but I wasn't sure how to handle it. I blocked his email, hoping that would stop the photos from coming, but it didn't. Over the next week, I got more emails from different addresses, each one containing a new photo. The images were always of me, either sitting at a cafe, walking around the city, or doing random errands. He was following me, documenting my life like I was some kind of subject for his twisted art project. I started feeling paranoid every time I left my apartment. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to snap another photo. I would look over my shoulder constantly, scanning the streets for any sign of him. But I never saw him. He was always just out of sight, lurking somewhere nearby. I stopped going to the places I used to frequent. I changed my routines, taking different routes to work, avoiding my favorite coffee shops, and staying away from the park. But no matter what I did, the photos kept coming. It was like he always knew where I would be, like he had somehow figured out my schedule. Each new photo felt more invasive than the last. At one point, I considered going to the police, but I wasn't sure what I could even say. I had no proof that it was Dan taking the photos, and even if I did, what could they do? It wasn't like he had physically harmed me or made any direct threats. All I had were these creepy, stalker-like emails with photos of me going about my daily life. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I was starting to feel like I was losing control. I tried talking to a few friends about it, but they didn't know what to say. They were sympathetic, but most of them didn't seem to understand the extent of how terrifying it was. Some even suggested that maybe it was just a harmless obsession, that Dan was probably just infatuated with me. But I knew it was more than that. This wasn't about attraction or admiration. It was about power. He was controlling my life without even being there, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. The breaking point came when I received an email that wasn't just a photo. It was a video. My hands were shaking as I opened the attachment. The video started with me walking into my apartment building. The camera followed me from a distance as I unlocked the front door and went inside. The angle changed as the camera zoomed in on my window where the curtains were slightly open. I saw myself moving around inside, completely unaware that I was being filmed. The video was only a minute long, but it felt like an eternity. I couldn't breathe. My apartment was supposed to be my safe space, the one place I could escape from him, but now he had violated that too. I immediately closed the curtains and shut off all the lights. feeling trapped inside my own home. The thought that he had been outside, watching me through my window, made my skin crawl. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I had never experienced before. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow outside my window felt like it could be him. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I was scared to leave my apartment, but I was just as scared to stay. I kept checking my phone, half expecting another email to come through with more footage, but nothing came. The next day, I finally reached out to a friend who worked in tech. I didn't give them all the details, just enough to let them know I was being stalked online and needed help blocking the emails. They were able to trace some of the addresses back to a proxy server, which meant Dan had been covering his tracks. That just made the whole thing worse. He wasn't just some amateur creep. He knew what he was doing. After my friend helped me block the emails, the photos stopped. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. But the damage had already been done. Even though the photos weren't coming anymore, I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every time I left my apartment, I was looking over my shoulder, scanning the streets for any sign of him. I had nightmares about him sneaking into my apartment, watching me from the shadows, taking more pictures without me knowing. It's been a while since all of this happened, but the fear still lingers. I'm more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings. I don't trust people as easily as I used to, and I'm always thinking about where the cameras are, who might be watching. Even though Dan is out of my life, I can't forget how easily someone can invade your privacy, how they can turn your normal everyday routine into a nightmare. A little over a year ago, I was using Tinder like a lot of people do. I matched with this guy named Tom, and at first everything seemed completely normal. I live in Seattle, and he was local too, which made meeting up easy. We started chatting back and forth for a couple of weeks, and he came across as really friendly. He had that typical Pacific Northwest vibe, outdoorsy, loved hiking, always posting pictures of him with his dog by a lake. I didn't feel any red flags, and we eventually made plans to meet up. Our first date was casual. We met at a cafe in Capitol Hill. Tom seemed super laid back in person, almost a little too perfect. He was easy to talk to, knew how to keep the conversation going, and made me feel comfortable. We both loved the outdoors, and he suggested going for a hike one weekend. Nothing about him raised any alarms. He was that kind of guy who seemed like he had his life together, a good job in tech, lived in a nice part of town, and came off as genuinely nice. After a few more dates, we started getting a bit more serious. I'd see him every weekend, and we'd do typical couple stuff. Go out to dinner, catch a movie, or just hang out at his place. He lived in Ballard, not too far from the water, and his apartment was pretty nice. It was modern, clean, and just another sign that he seemed to have his life in order. I felt like I had lucked out, to be honest. Dating in Seattle can be tough, and here was this guy who seemed to tick all the boxes. We had been seeing each other for about 2 months when things started to get a little strange. One day, out of the blue, I got a message on Facebook from a woman I didn't know. It was just a simple message at first, saying that she needed to talk to me about Tom. I didn't respond right away because I thought it was probably spam or a scam, but something about it nagged at me. After a few hours, I finally opened the message, and it was a lot more detailed than I expected. The woman, who introduced herself as Jenna, claimed to be Tom's wife. I remember sitting there staring at my phone, my mind racing. It didn't make any sense. Tom had never mentioned being married, let alone anything serious about a previous relationship. The message from Jenna went on to accuse me of being a homewrecker, saying that Tom had been cheating on her with me and that they had 2 kids together. She didn't sound angry, she just sounded tired, like this had happened before. I was in complete shock. I had been seeing this guy for months and had no clue about any of this. At first, I didn't believe it. It felt too surreal, like it had to be some sort of mistake. I didn't know what to do, so I messaged Tom right away, asking him if he knew who this woman was. He responded pretty quickly, but instead of explaining anything, he got defensive. He claimed it was all a lie, saying that Jenna was crazy and had been stalking him for years. He said she wasn't his wife, just some old girlfriend who couldn't let go. The way he talked about her made me second-guess everything. He sounded so sure of himself, like this was just some inconvenience he had to deal with. I wanted to believe him. I didn't want to think that I had been seeing a guy who was lying to me from the beginning. But the message from Jenna stuck with me. Something about the way she had written it felt too real, too personal. I decided to dig a little deeper before confronting him about it again. A couple of days later, I found her Facebook profile. It didn't take long to figure out that she wasn't lying. Her entire page was filled with pictures of Tom and their 2 kids. There were photos of family vacations, birthday parties, and posts about their life together. There was no way she could have made all that up. It became clear that not only was she telling the truth, but Tom had been living this double life the entire time. I felt sick. Everything about him, everything he had told me was a lie. I didn't know how to process it. I had no idea that the guy I had been seeing for months was actually married with children. I went from being in what I thought was a normal, healthy relationship to realizing I was just part of some twisted game he was playing. I didn't confront him right away. I wanted to gather more information before deciding what to do next. I found more of Jenna's posts and saw that she had tagged Tom in several of them. That's when I realized Tom had a completely different name on Facebook. He had been using a fake name with me, probably to keep his real life hidden. His Facebook profile was private, but the posts from Jenna painted a clear picture. They had been married for over 5 years and lived in a house together in Bellevue, just across the water from Seattle. I felt completely blindsided. All those times we had been hanging out at his apartment, he must have been making up excuses to his wife about where he was. It was all starting to make sense now. The nights he wouldn't answer his phone, the weekends when he suddenly became unavailable because of work trips. I had been so trusting, so naive. The worst part was that I had started to really fall for him. I had let my guard down, and now I was stuck in this horrible situation. I didn't know if I should tell Jenna the truth, confront Tom, or just walk away from it all. A part of me wanted to believe that maybe there was some explanation, that somehow he wasn't as bad as it seemed, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I decided to confront him in person. I needed to hear him admit what he had done, to see if there was any remorse in him. We met up at his place one evening, and I tried to keep my emotions in check. I didn't bring up the messages right away. I wanted to see if he would come clean on his own. But he didn't. He acted like everything was normal, like he hadn't been hiding this huge part of his life from me. When I finally brought up Jenna, his entire demeanor changed. He didn't get angry like I expected. Instead, he became cold. He barely denied it. He admitted that he was still married, but tried to spin it like it was some kind of complicated situation. He said they had been separated for years, but were still technically married because of legal reasons. He made it sound like it was no big deal, like I shouldn't be upset. But I could tell he was lying. He didn't care about me. He didn't care about Jenna or his kids either. He was just trying to keep everything together so he wouldn't lose control. The realization hit me hard. I had never really known this man. Everything he had shown me was just an act. I left his apartment that night feeling numb. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry at that point. I just felt empty. It was like everything I had built with him had crumbled away in an instant, and there was nothing left. After that, I blocked him on everything. I didn't want to hear from him again. I didn't respond to Jenna either. I figured she probably already knew the truth, and I wasn't sure if getting involved would make things worse. It wasn't my place to tell her how to handle her marriage. I just wanted to move on and forget any of it had ever happened. I matched with this guy named Ben on Tinder almost 2 years ago. At the time, I was living in Austin, Texas. I wasn't super serious about dating, just kind of seeing what was out there. Ben seemed perfect from the get-go. His profile had all the typical stuff, pictures of him hiking, hanging out with friends, and some shots of him at what looked like a decent job.
His bio said he worked in finance, and he mentioned loving live music, which was a huge plus in a city like Austin. I've always been into going to shows, so that felt like a connection right away. We started chatting pretty quickly after matching, and it felt natural. Ben was charming but not overbearing, and he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. We talked about our favorite spots in the city, the best taco trucks, and places to check out live music. There was nothing about him that seemed off, and our conversations were smooth. He had this way of making you feel like you were the center of his attention, but it didn't come across as creepy or forced. After a few days of chatting back and forth, we decided to meet up. We grabbed drinks at a bar downtown somewhere on 6th Street, if I remember correctly. It was a trendy spot, busy but not so packed that we couldn't have a conversation. In person, Ben was just as he seemed online, well-dressed, polite, and confident. He asked me about my job, my family, and what brought me to Austin. I had moved there for work, and he mentioned he had grown up a few hours outside the city. I didn't think to question it at the time. Everything he said seemed plausible, and he didn't give me any reason to doubt him. Over the next couple of weeks, we went on a few more dates. Dinner, more drinks, and once we even went kayaking on Lady Bird Lake. It was fun, and I started to like him more and more. He seemed to be this great mix of someone who had their life together but wasn't boring or too serious. He didn't push for anything too fast, and it felt like things were moving at a comfortable pace. But then, out of nowhere, little things started to happen that I didn't really notice until later. He'd ask me seemingly harmless questions like where I usually parked when I went to work or what time I got home from the gym. It didn't raise any red flags initially, but thinking back, I realized how strange it was. These weren't normal questions you'd ask when getting to know someone. They were too specific, too targeted. At the time, though, I didn't think much of it. I just thought he was showing interest in my day-to-day life. One night, after about a month of dating, we went out for dinner at a small restaurant near my apartment. It was a nice evening, and we had a good time, but when I got home, I noticed something odd. My apartment didn't feel quite right. Nothing was missing, but it just felt like someone had been there. I brushed it off as me being paranoid. I lived alone, so sometimes I'd come home and convince myself I'd left a door unlocked or a light on when I hadn't. But this time, it felt different. I checked everything, but nothing seemed out of place, so I tried to let it go. A week later, something similar happened. I came home from work and found that my laptop, which I usually left on my desk, had been moved. It was subtle, just a shift in how it was placed, but I knew I hadn't touched it that morning. Again, nothing was stolen, and nothing else in the apartment seemed disturbed. I tried to convince myself I was just being overly anxious or forgetting things, but this time I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I double-checked all the locks and even thought about getting a camera, but I ended up deciding against it. It felt silly to be so paranoid over what could just be me forgetting where I placed things. Around the same time, I started noticing odd charges on my credit card. They weren't big purchases, just small things here and there. Gas stations I didn't remember stopping at, a random charge from a coffee shop in a part of town I never visited. At first, I thought it was just an error, or maybe something small I had forgotten about. But the charges kept coming, and they started to get more frequent. I called my bank, and they were able to reverse a few of the charges, but they couldn't figure out where they were coming from. I changed my passwords, ordered a new card, and thought that would be the end of it. But the strange things kept happening. I started getting weird emails from accounts I didn't recognize. They were vague, just random ads or promotions, but there were a lot of them, way more than usual. Then I got a few notifications that my email password had been reset. I thought maybe I had clicked on a phishing link by accident, but it was starting to feel like something more. That's when I remembered some of the personal questions Ben had asked me early on. At the time, they hadn't seemed odd, but now they felt calculated. I hadn't told him anything too private, but I had mentioned things like where I worked, the gym I went to, and some of my favorite spots around the city. He had enough information to get a sense of my routine,
and that thought alone sent a chill down my spine. I confronted him about the weird things that were happening, but he brushed it off, acting like I was being paranoid. He said I was probably just stressed from work or imagining things, and he played it off so smoothly that I almost believed him. Almost. But deep down, I knew something was off. The way he deflected my questions, the way he always seemed to have an answer for everything, it didn't sit right with me. After that conversation, I started to distance myself from him. I canceled plans, didn't respond to his texts as quickly, and tried to put some space between us. That's when things got worse. My identity was stolen. I didn't realize it at first. It started with those small charges, but then it escalated. I got a call from my bank saying someone had tried to open a credit card in my name. Then I received letters from 2 companies I had never heard of, thanking me for applying for loans. It was terrifying. I spent hours on the phone with my bank trying to sort everything out. They canceled the applications and helped me put fraud alerts on my accounts, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to Ben. He had enough information to start piecing things together. My address, my birth date, details from our conversations that seemed innocent at the time, but now felt sinister. One night, as I was lying in bed, I got a notification on my phone that my password for one of my accounts had been changed. I hadn't changed it. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I checked my email and saw that there had been multiple attempts to log into my accounts from an unknown device. I immediately reset all my passwords, added 2-factor authentication, and started to panic. I felt completely violated. Someone was inside my life, picking apart the pieces of my identity, and I couldn't stop it. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that it was Ben. He was the only person I had been close to in recent months, the only one who had access to enough personal details to pull this off. But I had no proof. I couldn't go to the police with just a hunch, and I didn't want to confront him directly because I wasn't sure how he would react. What if he denied everything? What if he turned it around on me? I stopped responding to his texts completely after that. I blocked his number and deleted my Tinder account. But the damage had already been done. The charges kept coming, the emails didn't stop, and my sense of security was completely shattered. I didn't feel safe in my own apartment anymore. Every time I heard a noise outside, I wondered if it was him. I installed locks, bought a security camera, and even thought about moving, but I knew that wouldn't solve the root of the problem. A few weeks later, I received an email from an unknown address. It was short, just a few lines, but it confirmed everything I had feared. The email said, "You should have trusted me. You can't run from this." My stomach dropped. It had to be Ben. He knew I was onto him, and now he was taunting me. I forwarded the email to my bank and reported it as part of the fraud investigation, but they couldn't trace it back to anyone. I haven't seen or heard from Ben since that email, but the fear never really goes away. I've changed all my passwords, canceled my credit cards, and locked down everything I can, but there's always that lingering worry that he's still out there, still watching, waiting for the next opportunity. I don't know what his endgame was or why he targeted me, but the fact that someone could infiltrate my life like that, so easily, so seamlessly, is terrifying. The scariest part is how normal it all seemed in the beginning. Ben wasn't some obvious predator. He didn't give off any warning signs. He was charming, funny, and completely believable. But he was methodical, calculated, and manipulative. He took his time, made me feel comfortable, and then used that trust against me. And by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late.
Last year, while living in Los Angeles, I matched with a guy named Jake on Tinder. It started like any other conversation on the app, just some light back and forth about favorite movies, music, and what we like to do around the city. He seemed pretty normal, had a couple of decent photos where he looked well put together, and didn't give off any weird vibes at first. He mentioned he liked to drive around and explore new parts of LA, and I told him I was always up for trying new spots for food or drinks. After about a week of chatting, Jake asked if I wanted to meet up for a drink. He offered to pick me up, which I was hesitant about. I had this rule that I didn't let guys from dating apps know where I lived right away, but I was tired that day from work and didn't want to deal with parking or driving in LA traffic. I figured it would be fine. After all, he seemed decent,
and I could always bail if something felt off. The plan was simple. He'd pick me up from my place in Silver Lake, and we'd head to a bar I liked in Echo Park. I made sure to let a couple of friends know where I was going and who I was meeting, just in case. You know, the usual precautions we all take when meeting someone new. I was nervous but excited to finally meet him. I got ready, threw on something casual, and waited outside my apartment for him to arrive. When he pulled up, the first thing I noticed was that his car was packed with random stuff. I remember thinking it looked more like someone who was in the middle of moving or maybe living out of their car. The back seat was crammed with boxes, bags, and what looked like old clothes. My brain started sending me warning signals, but I brushed them off, figuring he just hadn't gotten around to cleaning his car. I mean, a lot of people in LA live kind of messy, right? I got in and we started driving. At first, everything seemed fine. We made some small talk about work, the typical first date conversation, but something about the way he talked felt off. He kept asking weirdly specific questions about my daily routine, what time I usually left for work if I lived alone, and how often I went to certain places. I chalked it up to him trying to get to know me better, but it still felt strange. It wasn't like the usual first date banter. As we headed toward Echo Park, Jake suddenly said he knew a shortcut that would save us some time. I had lived in LA long enough to know that shortcuts usually didn't exist in this city, but I didn't say anything. He took a turn onto some side streets, and within minutes I had no idea where we were. I'm not great with directions, but I can usually get my bearings in most parts of the city. This time, though, everything felt unfamiliar. We started winding through residential streets that didn't look like the areas we were supposed to be near. The houses were spaced out more, and the streetlights were fewer and farther between. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but Jake casually mentioned that he didn't like people using their phones when they were together. That comment didn't sit well with me. It wasn't said in a joking way. It felt more like a command than anything else. I told him I needed to check something quickly, and he brushed it off, saying we were almost there. But we weren't. We kept driving, and the neighborhoods got more unfamiliar. The conversation had mostly died down at this point, and the silence in the car felt heavy. I tried to keep my cool, but I could feel my heart racing. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I knew this wasn't right. After a while, I made up some excuse about needing to meet a friend soon, hoping he'd get the hint and take me back. Instead, he laughed it off and kept driving, saying he wanted to show me something cool before we hit the bar. At this point, we were nowhere near the city center. The roads were getting darker, and there were fewer and fewer cars around. I was trying not to freak out, but my anxiety was building. I tried to stay calm and act like I wasn't worried, hoping that if I didn't show fear, he'd drop whatever this was. When we pulled up to a stoplight in a quieter area, I made a decision. I took out my phone and pretended to make a call, saying loudly that my friend was waiting for me at the bar. Jake glanced over at me, and for a second I wasn't sure how he'd react. He hesitated, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Then, without a word, he turned the car around and started heading back toward more familiar streets. The entire drive back was tense. I kept my phone out, making it seem like I was still on the call, but I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to escalate the situation, but I needed to get out of that car. We finally got closer to the bar, and as soon as we reached a stop where I recognized the area, I told him to pull over. I didn't care how far it was from the bar at that point. I just wanted out. He stopped, and I quickly got out, muttering something about meeting up with friends before slamming the door behind me. I walked quickly toward the main street, keeping my phone in my hand and pretending to talk to someone the entire time. I didn't look back until I reached the bar, where there were people around. When I finally looked, Jake's car was gone. I went inside the bar, ordered a drink, and sat there trying to process what had just happened. I didn't stay long, though. I left after about half an hour, grabbed a rideshare back to my apartment, and locked the door behind me. I blocked Jake's number and unmatched him on Tinder that same night. I couldn't stop thinking about it, though. Why did he drive me so far out of the way? What was he planning to show me? Every time I replayed the night in my head, It felt like I had barely escaped something much worse. There were so many small red flags that I ignored. The packed car, the weird questions, the way he insisted on driving through those dark side streets. It all seemed so obvious in hindsight, but at the moment I kept convincing myself that I was overreacting, that maybe I was being too paranoid. For the next few days, I kept expecting him to try and contact me again. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, thinking I'd see his car parked outside my apartment or waiting for me somewhere. But he never reached out. I didn't hear from him again, which should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The fact that he just disappeared made the whole thing feel even more unsettling. It was like he knew I was onto him, and instead of trying to explain himself, he just moved on to whatever his next plan was. I never went on another date from Tinder after that. I deleted the app a week later, and to this day, I haven't gone back to it. I still think about Jake sometimes, though, especially when I'm driving at night and see a car that looks like his. I'll never know what his intentions were that night, but I'm just glad I trusted my gut and got out when I did. I met this guy named David on Tinder about a year ago. I wasn't really looking for anything serious, just someone to hang out with, maybe grab a drink or dinner with every now and then. David seemed like a decent guy from his profile. He had a good job, worked as a software engineer, and liked to travel. His photos were normal, nothing overly staged or weird. He looked like a regular guy, someone you'd run into at a bar or a cafe. We started messaging, and he was easy to talk to. He wasn't one of those guys who immediately tried to flirt or get weird, which was refreshing. He asked about my interests, my favorite spots in the city, that kind of thing. I didn't think too much about it at first, but he did seem pretty interested in my past relationships. He casually asked how long I had been single, and if I had dated anyone recently. I didn't see anything strange about it at the time. It felt like the normal getting-to-know-you questions people ask when they're interested in someone. After chatting for about a week, we made plans to meet up. We agreed on a casual dinner at a place in Center City that wasn't too far from my apartment. When we met, he was exactly as he seemed online. A little reserved, but polite and friendly. The date went fine, nothing too remarkable. We talked about work, our favorite restaurants in Philly, and the typical first date stuff. But every now and then, he'd steer the conversation back to my ex, asking questions like what went wrong in the relationship or how long we had been together. Again, I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe he was just curious. Everyone has a past, right? As the night went on, I noticed David kept glancing at his phone. It wasn't like he was texting or checking the time, it was more like he was waiting for something. I didn't ask about it, though. I figured maybe it was just a habit or something. After dinner, we said our goodbyes, and I didn't feel any strong connection, but I figured he was nice enough to see again. Maybe give it one more shot before deciding whether or not to keep dating him. That's when things started getting weird. A few days later, I got a message from my ex. We hadn't spoken in months, and it wasn't exactly an amicable breakup. So when I saw his name pop up on my phone, I felt a little on edge. The message was strange. He said that some guy had been asking about me, showing him pictures from my Tinder profile and asking for details about our relationship. I had no idea what he was talking about at first, but then it clicked. It had to be David. He was the only person I had talked to recently, and the only person who knew anything about my ex. I felt my stomach drop. Why would David be tracking down my ex and showing him my Tinder photos? We had only been on one date. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I messaged David and asked him casually if he had tried to contact anyone I knew. He denied it, of course, but something about the way he responded made me uncomfortable. He got defensive, saying it must have been a misunderstanding and that I was being paranoid. I wanted to believe him, but the whole situation felt off. I decided to let it go for the time being, but a week later I started noticing strange things happening. One evening I was walking home from work when I spotted someone across the street. It was dark and I couldn't make out his face, but he was standing there, not moving, just kind of watching from the other side. I kept walking, trying not to look over too much, but it made me feel uneasy. The next day I noticed the same thing. It wasn't the same guy, at least I didn't think so, but it was the same feeling. Someone was nearby, standing just far enough away that I couldn't tell who it was. This time I quickened my pace and went straight home, trying to shake the uneasiness. Maybe it was just a coincidence, someone waiting for a bus or walking their dog. I told myself I was overreacting. A few days after that, I ran into my ex at a coffee shop. It wasn't planned, just one of those random run-ins that happen when you live in the same city. He looked a little shaken when he saw me, and before I could even say anything, he blurted out that David had contacted him again. This time, David had shown up at his gym. They didn't speak, but my ex said he saw David watching him from across the parking lot. That was when I started to get really scared. I cut off all communication with David after that. I didn't respond to his messages, didn't agree to any more dates. I blocked his number and unmatched him on Tinder, but it didn't stop. A few days later, I started getting strange texts from an unknown number. They weren't threatening, but they were unsettling. The messages would just be things like "saw you today" or "you looked nice in that red jacket." The first time it happened, I thought maybe it was a prank or just a weird coincidence, but then it kept happening. Each message was more specific, referencing things I had done that day or places I had been. It was clear that someone was watching me. I told myself it couldn't be David. He didn't seem like the type to do something like this. But then again, what did I really know about him? We had only gone on one date, and everything I thought I knew was based on surface-level conversations. I started to change my routine. I stopped going to my usual gym and started taking different routes to work. I even stopped going to some of my favorite spots in the city, hoping that whoever was watching me would lose track of where I was. But it didn't seem to matter. The texts kept coming, and every time I tried to block the number, a new one would pop up. One night, I was heading home after grabbing dinner with a friend when I noticed a car following me. It wasn't obvious at first, but after a few blocks, I realized the same car had been behind me for a while. I tried to stay calm, thinking it was just another random coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I took a few extra turns, hoping to lose them, but the car kept following. Finally, I pulled over into a well-lit parking lot, hoping they would drive past, but they didn't. The car pulled over too, parking a few spots down from me. I stayed in my car, my heart racing, trying to decide what to do. I didn't want to get out, but I didn't want to stay there either. I watched the car from my rearview mirror, and after what felt like an eternity, the headlights flicked on and the car slowly pulled away. I waited a few minutes before driving home, and when I finally got there, I rushed inside and locked all the doors. That night, I barely slept. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there watching me. I started to wonder if David had somehow gotten access to more of my personal information. My address, my schedule, my friends. It felt like my entire life was under a microscope, and I had no idea how to stop it. I reached out to a friend who had some connections in tech, and he helped me run a few checks on my phone and social media accounts. He couldn't find anything obvious, but he said it was possible that someone had been monitoring my online activity. That only made me more paranoid. I deleted most of my social media profiles, changed all my passwords, and even considered moving to a new apartment. But nothing seemed to help. The texts stopped for a while, and I thought maybe I had finally gotten rid of whoever was watching me. But then, one night, I was walking home from a late shift at work, and I saw him. David was standing at the end of my street, just staring at me. He didn't say anything, didn't move. He just stood there, watching as I walked closer. My stomach dropped. I turned around and walked the other way, trying to stay calm, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. I didn't want to run and draw attention to myself, but every step I took felt heavier and more difficult. I made it around the corner and ducked into a nearby convenience store where I stayed for a while, hoping he would leave. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and windows, checked every room in the apartment, and tried to calm myself down. But I knew this wasn't over. David wasn't going to just disappear, and I had no idea what he wanted or how far he was willing to go. For the next few weeks, I stayed on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to show up again. I started carrying pepper spray with me everywhere I went and made sure to always let someone know where I was going. I didn't see David again after that night, but the fear never really went away. It's been almost a year now, and I still think about it every time I'm walking alone or when I get a text from an unknown number. I matched with a guy named Mark on Tinder a while back when I was living in New York City. It wasn't unusual for me to go on dating apps and casually swipe through profiles. You know how it is. Sometimes you find someone who seems interesting and you figure, why not? Mark's profile didn't stand out as anything special, but he looked attractive and seemed friendly enough. He mentioned he was a talent scout for models and that he worked in the fashion industry. His photos were polished but not overly posed, and his bio mentioned he was always on the lookout for fresh talent in the city. At first, I thought nothing of it. It's New York after all, so running into people in the fashion industry isn't exactly rare. We started chatting, and he came off as really laid back. He asked me about my hobbies, what I did for work, and if I'd ever considered modeling. I thought he was just making conversation, and while I'd never really considered myself model material, it was flattering in a way. I figured he was just being nice. After a few days of back and forth, Mark told me he thought I had a look that might work for some projects he was working on. I'm not someone who gets wrapped up in compliments from strangers, but the way he talked made it sound like a legitimate opportunity. He wasn't pushy about it either, just casually mentioned that if I was interested, he could introduce me to a few people and see where it went. It sounded pretty innocent. I thought about it for a bit and figured, why not? I wasn't expecting to become a model or anything, but the idea of doing something different for fun sounded appealing. Plus, he seemed professional, and it didn't feel like one of those sketchy modeling scout scams you hear about. We made plans to meet, and he said he'd bring me to a small studio to get some test shots taken. The day we were supposed to meet, he told me the studio was a bit out of the way in Brooklyn. That wasn't strange. There are plenty of creative spaces in Brooklyn, and not everything happens in Manhattan. He sent me the address, and I looked it up online. It seemed like a regular, if somewhat industrial area. Lots of warehouses and old buildings that had been converted into studios or lofts. I didn't think too much of it. When I got there, it was a little more rundown than I expected. The area wasn't sketchy, but it wasn't exactly inviting either. The building was old, with graffiti on the walls and a couple of boarded-up windows. Still, I figured it could just be one of those hidden gems, a cheap space for creatives in a city where rent is insane. I texted Mark and he said he'd meet me outside. He showed up a few minutes later, smiling and friendly as ever. He was dressed well, like he'd just come from a business meeting, and he had a camera bag slung over his shoulder. Nothing about him screamed dangerous or untrustworthy. We chatted for a bit, and he led me inside the building. The lobby was dark and dingy, with flickering lights and peeling wallpaper. It didn't exactly feel like a professional studio, but again I told myself it was probably just a low-budget space. We took an elevator up to the 3rd floor, and the place was dead silent. There weren't any signs of other people or noise from other rooms, which I thought was a little strange for a studio building. When we got to the floor, Mark led me down a long, dimly lit hallway. There were a few doors along the way, but they were all closed, and none of them had any signage. It felt more and more like we were in an abandoned building rather than a functioning studio. I started to feel uneasy, but I didn't want to come off as paranoid. I told myself that maybe this was just how these smaller studios operated. Off the beaten path, a bit rough around the edges. We reached a door at the end of the hall, and Mark unlocked it with a key. Inside, the room was small and bare. There was no fancy setup, no professional lighting, no backdrops or equipment you'd expect in a photo studio. Just an empty room with some old furniture shoved into a corner and a single overhead light casting harsh shadows. It was unsettling. There wasn't even a desk or anything that would indicate this place was used for professional work. Mark didn't seem fazed by any of this. He told me to take a seat while he got his camera ready, but at that point something in my gut was telling me this wasn't right. I stayed standing and asked him where the other people were. He had mentioned earlier that there would be a makeup artist, and another photographer here to help with the shoot. He brushed it off, saying they were running late, but that we could start without them. That was when I really started to panic. Nothing about this felt professional. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to overreact, but at the same time, every alarm in my head was going off. I made up an excuse about needing to step outside for a moment and said I'd be right back. Mark tried to convince me to stay, saying we could get started now and that the others would arrive soon, but I insisted that I needed a minute. I walked out of the room, my heart racing, and made my way back down the hallway. The building was still dead silent, and I didn't pass a single person on my way to the elevator. I kept my head down, trying not to let on how freaked out I was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. When I reached the lobby, I practically ran outside and called a rideshare to get me out of there as fast as possible. As I waited for the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting Mark to come out after me. He didn't, but the whole situation had left me on edge. When the car finally arrived, I jumped in and gave the driver my address, feeling a wave of relief wash over me as we pulled away from the building. I spent the rest of the night trying to shake off the weird feeling, but it stuck with me. I couldn't stop thinking about how strange it had all been. The empty building, the lack of equipment, the fact that no one else was there like he'd said they would be. I felt stupid for not trusting my instincts sooner and for letting myself get into that situation in the first place. A few days later, I decided to look up the building online again, trying to see if there was anything I had missed. That's when I found out that the address Mark had given me wasn't listed as a studio at all. It wasn't even registered as a commercial property. From what I could tell, the building was mostly empty, with a few abandoned lofts and storage units inside. There was nothing professional about it. I went back to Mark's profile on Tinder, but it was gone. He had either deleted it or unmatched me. I couldn't find him anywhere else online either. No social media profiles, no LinkedIn, nothing. It was like he had disappeared completely. I didn't know what to make of it. Was he just some random creep? Or was there something more sinister going on? The whole situation left me feeling shaken and paranoid.
I reside in San Francisco, and about a year ago, as I was browsing through Tinder, I matched with a woman named Alice. She was from the same city, which made it easy to set up a date. We had been talking for about 2 weeks, nothing too intense, just casual conversation. Alice seemed cool, a little reserved, but interesting enough to keep chatting with. She wasn't overly flirty or trying too hard, which I liked. Her pictures were normal, nothing that screamed catfish or made me question if she was real. She mentioned she worked in tech, which is pretty common in San Francisco, and that she lived with a couple of roommates. One night we decided to meet up for drinks, but something came up, and she had to cancel last minute. It wasn't a big deal, so we rescheduled for a few days later. This time she suggested that I come over to her place instead. Said her roommates were out, and it would be more comfortable than a crowded bar. I hesitated a little, but I agreed. It felt a bit weird to go to someone's house for a first date, but she had been normal up until that point. And I figured maybe she just didn't want to deal with the hassle of going out. I took an Uber to her place, which was in a quiet part of the Mission District not far from Dolores Park. When I got there, the neighborhood seemed normal enough. Older homes, a mix of young professionals and families. Nothing about it seemed off. I texted her that I was outside and she buzzed me in. The building itself was one of those older Victorian-style houses that had been converted into apartments. It had character, a bit run down, but nothing unusual for that part of the city. I walked up the stairs to her door, and when she opened it, she looked just like her pictures. She smiled, welcomed me in, and offered me a drink. Everything seemed fine, but as soon as I stepped inside, something felt a little off. The apartment was way too quiet. She had mentioned having roommates, but there was no sign of anyone else living there. No shoes by the door, no noise from another room, nothing. The apartment was clean, almost too clean, and there was this weird smell. Not bad, just odd. Like the air had been sitting too long, almost stale.
We made small talk for a while and she seemed nice enough, but there was this tension in the air I couldn't quite put my finger on. Every time I asked about her roommates, she got a little vague, saying they were out for the night but would probably be back late. I let it slide, trying not to be too paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She asked if I wanted to sit in the living room, and when we got there, I noticed the apartment looked almost staged. Like someone had gone out of their way to make it look lived in, but it didn't feel natural. The furniture was sparse, just a couch, a coffee table, and a couple of chairs, but there were no personal touches, no photos, no books, no clutter. The kind of stuff you'd expect to see in someone's home just wasn't there. It was like walking into a furnished rental or a hotel room. As we sat down, I kept glancing around, trying to piece together what felt so off. The more I looked, the more unsettling it became. The walls were bare, no posters or decorations, and the windows had heavy curtains drawn over them, blocking out any view of the street. It felt like we were completely sealed off from the outside world. I tried to make conversation, but my mind kept wandering to the strangeness of the place. At one point, Alice excused herself to the bathroom, and as soon as she left the room, I noticed something weird. There was a door at the far end of the living room, partially hidden behind a large plant. It wasn't locked, but it was slightly ajar, and I could see that it led to a small hallway. I don't know why, but something about that door made me uneasy. I kept staring at it, half expecting someone to walk through at any moment. Alice came back a few minutes later, and I tried to ignore the feeling creeping up on me. She sat down next to me on the couch, a little closer than before, and started asking more personal questions. Nothing too invasive, but it felt like she was trying to steer the conversation in a certain direction. She asked if I lived alone, what my typical schedule was like, things like that. It made me uncomfortable, but I tried to play it off, answering vaguely without giving away too much. As the conversation continued, I couldn't stop thinking about that door. The longer I sat there, the more I felt like I needed to leave. I told Alice I had an early meeting the next day and should probably head out. She didn't seem surprised, but her response was strange. She just smiled and said, "I figured you'd want to go soon." That sent a chill down my spine. The way she said it was so casual, but it felt loaded with something else, like she knew I was uncomfortable and was playing along with it. I got up and thanked her for the drink, trying to keep my tone light, but inside I was freaking out. She didn't walk me to the door, just sat there on the couch, watching me as I grabbed my jacket and headed for the front door. As soon as I stepped out into the hallway, I felt a wave of relief, but I still had to make it down the stairs and out of the building. When I got to the street, I called an Uber and waited a block away from her place just to put some distance between us. As I stood there, I kept looking back at her building, half expecting her to follow me out or watch from one of the windows. But the place stayed quiet, no signs of life. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about the whole thing. The apartment didn't feel lived in, her weirdly vague answers about her roommates, the way she watched me leave without saying much. It all seemed wrong, but I couldn't figure out why. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself maybe she was just awkward or didn't have close roommates. But no matter how much I tried to make sense of it, I kept coming back to that door in the living room and the strange atmosphere of the apartment. The next day, I told a friend about the experience, and she agreed it sounded off. She suggested I look up the address online, see if anything weird had happened there, or if it was listed as a rental property. I spent some time searching, but I couldn't find anything specific about the apartment itself. There were a few general reviews of the building, but nothing that stood out as strange or alarming. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had dodged something bad that night. A few days later, I decided to check Tinder and see if Alice was still on there. Her profile was gone. I don't know if she unmatched me or deleted her account, but either way, it added another layer of weirdness to the whole situation. It was like she had disappeared, leaving me with no way to figure out what was really going on. I stopped using Tinder after that. It's not that I'm scared of dating or meeting new people, but the experience made me more cautious. You never really know who you're talking to online or what their intentions are. Everything can seem normal on the surface, but once you're in a situation, things can shift quickly. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened that night, but it's stuck with me ever since. I matched with this girl named Rachel on Tinder about 2 years ago. I was living in Chicago at the time, and she mentioned that she was new to the city trying to find her footing. We talked for a couple of weeks before deciding to meet up. She seemed normal. Her profile was filled with pictures of her hiking, eating at trendy restaurants, and a couple of shots of her exploring the city. We had some good conversations about Chicago and places she wanted to check out. It wasn't anything serious for me, I was just looking to hang out with someone new. Rachel told me she was visiting the city temporarily, trying to find a place to stay for a while. She mentioned she'd been staying with a friend but needed to move out soon, and finding a decent place in Chicago was tough. At first, I didn't think much of it. A lot of people come to Chicago, and the housing market here is pretty brutal if you don't know where to look. I've lived in the city for a few years, so I understood the struggle. One night, after we'd been talking for a bit, Rachel casually mentioned she was having a hard time finding a short-term rental and asked if she could crash at my place for a few days. She framed it in a way that made it seem like no big deal, just until she figured out her next steps. I'm usually not the kind of guy to let someone I barely know stay with me, but she seemed genuine and wasn't giving off any weird vibes. Plus, my apartment had a spare room that wasn't being used. It didn't seem like a big deal at the time, and I figured it would be a kind gesture. She showed up with just a couple of bags, like she was planning on staying for a few days and nothing more. The first night was fine. We grabbed some dinner at a local spot and chatted about the usual stuff: work, life, why she had moved to Chicago. She didn't get into a lot of detail about her life before moving here, just said she needed a change and that she was hoping to settle in a new city. The conversation was light and she was easy to talk to. Everything seemed perfectly normal. After the first night, things started to get weird. The next morning, I had to head to work, so I told her to make herself at home while I was gone. I didn't think much of it. I'd done her a favor, and she didn't seem like the type to take advantage of it. But when I came back that evening, the vibe in the apartment felt off. For starters, she had moved her stuff into the spare room, which I expected, but it looked like she had brought more than just the couple of bags she came with. There were boxes now, big ones, stacked neatly along the walls of the spare room, like she'd been planning to stay longer than she let on. I didn't ask her about it right away because I didn't want to seem rude, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. We had dinner again that night, and I tried to casually ask about the boxes. She brushed it off, saying she had picked them up from a storage unit she had rented but would be moving them soon. I didn't push the issue, but it made me uncomfortable. I hadn't agreed to let her use my apartment as a storage space, and now it was starting to feel like she was getting a little too comfortable. The next day, things got stranger. I came home from work and Rachel wasn't there, but her stuff had multiplied. There were more boxes, random bags, and even some furniture, an old chair and a couple of lamps that I definitely hadn't seen before. It was like my apartment was slowly being taken over by her things. I started to wonder how she'd managed to get all this stuff into my place without me noticing. I had been at work all day and there was no way she could have carried all of it by herself. I texted her asking where she was, and she responded a few hours later, saying she was out with friends and would be back later. I didn't want to be confrontational, but I told her that it felt like her stuff was piling up, and asked if she had found another place to stay. She didn't respond to that part of the text, just said she'd be back soon and we could talk then. By the time she got back, it was late, and I was sitting in the living room, waiting for her. When she came in, she acted like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't completely taken over my apartment with her stuff. I asked her again about the boxes and the furniture, and she got defensive, saying she didn't have anywhere else to put it. I wasn't sure how to respond. She hadn't been upfront with me about how much stuff she had, and now it was starting to feel like she was planning to stay a lot longer than I had agreed to. I told her that this wasn't what I had signed up for, that I was happy to help her out for a couple of days but couldn't let her stay indefinitely. She didn't argue or fight back, but the way she responded made me uneasy. She just smiled, nodded, and said she'd figure something out soon. There was something in her tone that felt off, like she wasn't really listening or didn't care what I was saying. The next morning, I woke up to find that she had left early, but her stuff was still there. I had to go to work, so I figured I'd deal with it when I got home, hoping she'd be gone by then. But when I came back that evening, the apartment was empty. Not just her things, everything. My apartment had been completely cleared out. Furniture, electronics, clothes, everything was gone. It was like I had been robbed, but there was no sign of forced entry. I stood there in shock, trying to process what had just happened. It didn't make any sense. How could someone clear out an entire apartment in a single day without anyone noticing? I checked my phone, expecting a message from Rachel, but there was nothing. I called her, but the number went straight to voicemail. I sent her a text, but it didn't go through. She had disappeared, along with everything I owned. I immediately called the police and reported the robbery, but I didn't have much to tell them. I had no idea where Rachel had gone, no last name, no real information about her background. She had come into my life, stayed for a few days, and then vanished with everything I owned. The police took a report, but they didn't seem hopeful about getting anything back. Without any leads, there wasn't much they could do. I spent the next few weeks trying to piece my life back together. I had to replace everything, my furniture, my clothes, my electronics. It was like starting over from scratch. Every time I thought about what had happened, I felt sick. How had I let this happen? How had I trusted someone I barely knew to stay in my apartment, let alone take advantage of me like that? I went back to Tinder to see if Rachel's profile was still up, but it was gone. She had either deleted it or unmatched me. I tried searching for her online, but I came up with nothing. It was like she had never existed. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't really know anything about her. I had trusted her based on a few weeks of casual conversation and some decent photos, but I hadn't bothered to dig deeper. She had played me, and I had fallen for it. To this day, I don't know what happened to Rachel or where she went. I never got any of my stuff back, and the police never found any leads. I met Tyler on Tinder last year when I was living in Denver. At first, everything about him seemed great. He had a decent job, worked in marketing for a local company, and had that outdoorsy Colorado vibe that most people in the city have. His pictures were normal: hiking, hanging out with friends, and one with his dog. The conversations flowed easily, and he was polite, funny, and interested in what I had to say. It didn't take long for us to plan a date. We met for drinks at a bar in Lodo, one of those trendy spots with craft cocktails and dim lighting. Tyler was just as charming in person as he had been over text. He asked about my job, my family, and what I like to do for fun. He seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me, which was refreshing compared to some of the other guys I had met through dating apps. We hit it off, and by the end of the night I was already looking forward to seeing him again. The next few dates went smoothly. We went hiking at Red Rocks, had dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Capitol Hill, and even went to a Rockies game together. Tyler was attentive, always checking in on me, asking how my day was, and sending little texts throughout the day to let me know he was thinking of me. It felt nice to be pursued like that, especially since I hadn't been in a serious relationship for a while. But after about a month, things started to shift in a way that I didn't notice right away. At first it was small things. Tyler would make comments about what I was wearing, suggesting that I try different outfits or saying that certain clothes didn't look great on me. It didn't feel malicious at the time, just him trying to be helpful. But the comments started happening more often, and they became more specific. He'd say things like, "You'd look better in something less revealing," or, "I don't think that color suits you." I brushed it off, thinking he was just trying to be supportive. The controlling behavior crept in slowly, and I didn't realize it was happening until it was too late. He started questioning where I was going and who I was spending time with. If I mentioned hanging out with friends, he'd ask which friends, and then he'd make little remarks about them. Do you really think she's a good influence on you? Or, I've heard things about him, maybe you should stay away. At first I didn't think much of it. He was just being protective, or so I thought. I figured he was looking out for me in his own way. One weekend I planned to meet up with some girlfriends for brunch. Tyler wasn't thrilled about it. He asked why I didn't want to spend the day with him instead, and when I told him I had made plans with my friends weeks ago, he got quiet. He didn't argue, but the next day, he showed up at the restaurant while we were eating. He acted like it was a coincidence, saying he was in the area, but it felt strange. He sat down with us for a while, and I could tell my friends were uncomfortable. After he left, they asked me if everything was okay. I told them it was just Tyler being Tyler, but their concern lingered in the back of my mind. From that point on, things escalated. Tyler would show up at my work unannounced, sometimes with coffee or lunch, which seemed sweet at first, but it became too frequent. He'd appear outside my apartment, claiming he was in the neighborhood and wanted to see me. If I didn't answer his texts right away, he'd send more, asking why I wasn't responding and if everything was okay. If I told him I was busy, he'd get annoyed, saying he just wanted to make sure I was all right. It felt like he was constantly checking up on me, but I kept telling myself he was just being a good boyfriend. The turning point came when I went out for a work event. It was a happy hour with colleagues at a bar downtown. Tyler knew about it and didn't seem to have any issues with me going. But about an hour into the event, he showed up again, this time without any explanation. He wasn't just in the area. He acted friendly at first, making small talk with my coworkers, but I could feel the tension underneath his calm demeanor. When we left the bar, he was cold, accusing me of flirting with a guy from work. I told him he was being ridiculous, but he wouldn't let it go. He kept pushing, asking why I didn't invite him to the event in the first place, why I didn't introduce him to more of my coworkers. The argument dragged on, and by the time I got home, I was exhausted. After that night, I tried to create some distance between us. I stopped responding to his texts as quickly, and I made excuses to not hang out as often. But Tyler didn't take the hint. He'd show up at my apartment unannounced, banging on the door until I let him in. He'd call repeatedly, leaving voicemails if I didn't pick up, saying he was worried about me. He even showed up at my gym one morning, standing outside waiting for me when I finished my workout. When I asked how he knew where I was, he shrugged and said he had guessed. But I knew it wasn't a guess. He had been keeping track of my routine. One night I went out with some friends for a birthday party. I didn't tell Tyler about it because I didn't want him to show up and cause another scene. I was having a good time, finally feeling like I had some space from him, but then I noticed him standing by the door. My heart sank. He hadn't said anything to me, hadn't texted or called, but he was just standing there watching. When our eyes met, he walked over, acting like it was no big deal. He said he wanted to surprise me and that he'd figured I'd be there because it was my friend's birthday. It was that moment that I realized just how far Tyler had crossed the line. He had been keeping tabs on me, tracking my movements and showing up wherever I went. I was terrified but didn't know how to confront him. I didn't want to escalate things, so I acted normal, hoping he'd leave on his own. He stayed for the rest of the night, barely letting me out of his sight. After that, I decided I needed to end things. I couldn't take the constant monitoring, the possessiveness, and the way he made me feel like I was under surveillance 24/7. I was scared of how he'd react, but I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I tried to break up with him over the phone, but he refused to accept it. He kept calling, showing up at my apartment, pleading with me to talk to him in person. One night I came home to find him sitting on the steps outside my building, waiting for me. I hadn't told him where I'd been or when I'd be back, but there he was, like he always knew. He begged me to let him in, saying we needed to talk face to face. I was too scared to say no, so I let him inside. As soon as he stepped through the door, his demeanor changed. He wasn't the pleading, desperate guy I'd seen outside. He was angry. He started pacing around my apartment, asking why I was doing this, why I wanted to leave him. He He accused me of cheating, of lying to him, of hiding things. I tried to stay calm, explaining that I just needed space, that things weren't working anymore. But he wasn't listening. At one point, he grabbed my phone and started scrolling through my messages, demanding to know who I had been talking to. When I tried to take it back, he got aggressive, gripping it tighter and telling me that he had a right to know. I was shaking, trying to keep my voice steady as I told him to leave, but he wouldn't go. He kept pushing, saying that we needed to fix things, that I was overreacting, that he loved me and couldn't let me go. It wasn't until I threatened to call the police that he finally left. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him, but not before warning me that he wasn't going to give up on us. For the next few days, I barely left my apartment. I was terrified that he'd show up again, that he'd be waiting for me outside, following me wherever I went. I blocked his number, deleted his messages, and tried to cut off all contact. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, still keeping tabs on me, just waiting for the right moment to show up again. My experience happened 10 months ago when I matched with a guy named Chris on Tinder. I live in Miami and he was local too. His profile seemed pretty normal, pictures of him on a boat, a few shots with friends, and one of him at a restaurant with some expensive-looking food in front of him. His bio mentioned he was a successful entrepreneur, owned his own business, and loved traveling. It wasn't anything flashy, just the right amount of "I have my life together," without being over the top. He looked like a guy who had his priorities straight, and after matching with so many people who had no direction, that was refreshing. We started chatting, and he was smooth, not in a creepy, overly flirtatious way, but confident. He asked about my job, what I like to do for fun, and seemed genuinely interested. We bonded over our shared love for Miami's nightlife, talked about our favorite restaurants and spots to hang out, and he dropped little hints about the places he liked to frequent, the kind of high-end places you hear about but rarely go to unless it's a special occasion. He mentioned that he worked in investments and had built his company from the ground up, which sounded impressive, but he wasn't bragging about it. After a couple of weeks of texting, he suggested we meet up for dinner. He picked this restaurant in Brickell, one of those swanky spots with a view of the skyline, the kind of place I'd never been to before. I wasn't used to guys suggesting places like that on a first date, so it felt exciting. He offered to pick me up, but I declined and said I'd meet him there. I didn't want to risk giving a guy I barely knew my address, even though everything about him seemed perfectly normal. When I got to the restaurant, Chris was already there, waiting outside. He looked just like his pictures, which was a relief, tall, well-dressed, and put together. He greeted me with a smile and a hug, and we went inside. The restaurant was beautiful, and he seemed to know everyone there. The hostess greeted him by name, and the staff treated him like a regular. I felt a little out of place, but Chris was smooth and made me feel comfortable right away. The dinner was great. He was charming, funny, and asked all the right questions. He told me more about his business, how he'd started it from scratch and made some smart investments that paid off. It sounded legitimate, and he didn't go into too many details, which made it feel like he wasn't trying to impress me with money, just sharing his story. After dinner, he insisted on paying, saying it was his treat, and I didn't argue. It felt like the kind of night you see in movies: expensive wine, great food, and the skyline lit up outside the window. After dinner, we went for a walk along the waterfront, and he casually mentioned this business opportunity he was involved in. At first, I didn't think much of it. Everyone in Miami seems to have some kind of side hustle or investment they're working on, but the way he talked about it made it sound too good to be true. He said it was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to get in early on something big, something that was going to blow up in the next few months. I was intrigued, but also cautious. It sounded like one of those investment pitches that people make when they're trying to get you involved in some kind of pyramid scheme. Chris wasn't pushy, though. He didn't try to sell me on it that night. He just planted the seed, saying that if I was ever interested, he'd be happy to talk more about it. We ended the night on a good note,
and I went home thinking maybe I'd finally found someone who wasn't just playing games. Over the next few weeks, we kept texting and seeing each other. He'd take me to more high-end spots, rooftop bars, exclusive clubs, and he always picked up the tab. It was hard not to be impressed. Chris clearly had money, and he was generous with it, but he never made me feel like I owed him anything. The whole thing felt like I was dating someone who had it all figured out. Then he started bringing up the business opportunity again. This time, he was a little more specific. He said it was a tech startup that he had invested in early, and it was about to go public. He made it sound like he had insider knowledge, like he knew this company was going to be huge, and that anyone who got in early would make a fortune. He mentioned that he had already made a lot of money from similar investments, and now he wanted to help people close to him get in on this one before it was too late. I was skeptical, but Chris had this way of making everything sound so legitimate. He wasn't pressuring me, just offering what seemed like an amazing opportunity. He said he'd already put in a significant amount of his own money and that he didn't need anything from me. But if I wanted in, I could invest as much or as little as I wanted. He made it sound like I'd be stupid not to at least consider it. Eventually, I caved. After all, he'd shown me nothing but kindness, and everything about him seemed real. I figured if this was something he was willing to risk his own money on, it couldn't be that bad, right? So I decided to invest a small amount, nothing life-changing, but enough that I'd notice if it disappeared. Chris made it easy. He didn't ask for cash or anything shady. Instead, he told me to wire the money directly to a legitimate-sounding investment account that he said was connected to the startup. I did my research on the account and everything seemed to check out. After I sent the money, things didn't seem that different at first. Chris and I kept hanging out, going to nice restaurants and bars, but he was a little more distant. He didn't bring up the investment again, and I didn't push for details. I figured it was one of those things that would take time to pay off. But then, about a month later, Chris started getting harder to reach. He'd cancel plans last minute or take hours to respond to texts. When we did meet up, he seemed distracted, always on his phone or talking about some new business deal he was working on. Then one day, he just disappeared. He stopped responding to my texts and calls altogether. His social media went dark, and his phone number was suddenly disconnected. It was like he had vanished overnight. At first, I was worried. Maybe something had happened to him. Maybe he was in trouble. But as the days went on and I heard nothing, I started to suspect something worse. I tried to log into the investment account he had set up for me, but I couldn't. The account didn't exist anymore. I reached out to the bank trying to figure out what had happened, and that's when it all started to unravel. The account had been closed and there was no record of my investment. It became clear that Chris had been playing me from the start. He wasn't a successful entrepreneur, he was a scam artist, and I had fallen for it. The girl I matched with on Tinder was named Lisa. She seemed normal enough, nothing out of the ordinary on her profile. Just some photos of her with friends, a few shots of her at some parks around the city, and one with her dog. We started chatting and it was pretty easy going. We talked about the usual stuff. Work, hobbies, what we like to do around New York. It was a decent back and forth and we decided to meet up for a drink after about a week of texting. We picked a bar in Williamsburg, not too far from my apartment, and everything seemed fine at first. She was pretty much the same as her profile. Easy to talk to, friendly, and kind of funny in a low-key way. We were having a good time, just talking about the city, sharing stories about work, and it felt like a regular first date. Then she casually mentioned that she lived nearby, just a few streets over. I thought it was kind of a coincidence. Brooklyn's big, but it's not uncommon to run into people who live close by, especially in neighborhoods like Williamsburg, where there's a mix of people around the same age. She seemed nice, and I didn't think much of it. The date went well enough, and by the end of the night, we said we'd hang out again. A couple of days later, we made plans to meet up again for coffee at this spot in Greenpoint. When I got there, she was already sitting outside with her dog. We chatted for a while, and again everything felt normal. But then she brought up that she had noticed me jogging in the park a couple of days ago. That threw me off a little because I didn't remember telling her where I went jogging or even mentioning that I jog regularly. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe she had seen me by chance since we lived in the same area. After that, I started seeing Lisa more often, almost too often. I'd be out running errands, walking around the neighborhood, or grabbing a coffee, and there she'd be. At first, it seemed like coincidence. Brooklyn isn't that small, but I figured we just happened to frequent the same spots since we lived nearby. She'd always wave and smile, acting casual, like it was no big deal. But after a while, it started to feel off. It wasn't just random run-ins anymore. She'd appear at places where I hadn't mentioned I'd be. I'd be heading to the grocery store on a random Tuesday, and suddenly she'd be there too, standing by the entrance like she was just about to go in. I tried to chalk it up to coincidence, but it kept happening, and it started to make me uncomfortable. One time I was at a small, low-key bar that I hadn't mentioned to anyone. I was meeting up with some friends from work, and there she was again, sitting at the bar alone. It wasn't the kind of place you'd just stumble upon, and it felt too coincidental for her to be there at the same time. I felt uneasy, but I didn't say anything. She waved and came over to say hi. My friends asked how we knew each other, and I awkwardly explained that we had gone on a couple of dates. Lisa stuck around for a little while before leaving, but the whole thing left me feeling strange. After that night, I decided to distance myself a bit. I didn't text her back as quickly, didn't suggest meeting up, hoping she'd take the hint. But she didn't. Instead, I started seeing her even more. She'd show up outside my building when I was leaving for work, or be walking her dog down my street when I was getting home. It felt deliberate, like she was positioning herself to run into me. I told myself I was overthinking it, that maybe it was just a string of weird coincidences, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next time we ran into each other, I asked her how she seemed to be everywhere I was. She laughed it off, saying it was just luck or maybe fate, but the way she said it gave me chills. She wasn't joking. It felt like she really believed it was some kind of sign that we kept bumping into each other. I tried to brush it off again, but my instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. One night, I was home alone watching TV when I heard a knock at the door. It was late, maybe around 10 p.m., and I wasn't expecting anyone. When I checked the peephole, it was Lisa standing there holding a bag from the bakery down the street. I hadn't told her where I lived, and I definitely hadn't invited her over. My stomach dropped. I opened the door just enough to talk to her, and she acted like it was no big deal that she had shown up unannounced. She said she had been walking her dog and thought she'd drop by with some pastries because she knew I liked them. I didn't know how to respond. I hadn't given her my address, and I didn't understand how she had found out where I lived. I made up an excuse about being busy and told her I couldn't hang out. She seemed disappointed but left without making a fuss. After she walked away, I locked the door and sat there trying to process what had just happened. I felt violated, like my space had been invaded, and I couldn't figure out how she had found me. The next morning, I woke up to a text from her, saying she had a great time seeing me last night and hoped we could hang out again soon. That was the breaking point for me. I didn't respond and decided I needed to put some serious distance between us. I stopped going to the places I knew she frequented, changed my jogging route, and made sure I didn't post anything on social media that would give away where I was. But it didn't stop her from showing up. I started noticing her more and more, even in places I hadn't been before. One day, I went to a completely different part of Brooklyn to meet a friend for lunch, and Lisa was there, sitting at a table a few feet away from us. She waved like it was just another coincidence, but I knew it wasn't. My friend asked who she was, and when I explained the situation, she looked at me like I was crazy for not cutting things off sooner. But it wasn't that simple. I didn't want to confront her directly because I didn't know how she'd react. Things escalated when I came home one night to find her standing outside my building again. This time, she didn't have an excuse for being there. She just stood there, waiting for me. I tried to act calm, asked her what she was doing, but she didn't give me a clear answer. She said she had been thinking about me and wanted to see if I was home. I felt trapped.
She wasn't being aggressive, but the way she was lingering made me uneasy. I told her I needed to get inside and left her standing there. I knew I needed to cut her off completely, but I didn't know how. I blocked her number and unmatched her on Tinder, but she kept finding ways to show up. I started getting random messages from unknown numbers, and I knew they were from her. She didn't threaten me or say anything overtly alarming, but the messages were just too specific. She mentioned places I had been recently, like she had seen me but hadn't approached. It made me paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, never sure if she was nearby watching. I never figured out how she knew so much about my routine, or how she always seemed to be where I was. I started to think she was following me, tracking my movements somehow, but I couldn't prove it. The more I tried to avoid her, the more she seemed to appear. It was like a game to her, and I didn't know how to make it stop. Eventually I moved. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, didn't post about it online, and made sure to change my routine completely. I haven't seen Lisa since, but I still think about her sometimes, wondering if she's doing the same thing to someone else, or if she's out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to show up again. I don't know what her endgame was, or why she became so fixated on me, but I'm just glad I got out before things got worse. A few years ago, I met a guy named Jason on Tinder. I was living in Seattle at the time, and dating apps were just kind of a way to kill time between work and seeing friends. Jason's profile didn't stand out too much, but he seemed normal enough. His photos showed him doing typical outdoorsy Seattle things, hiking, camping, and hanging out at bars with friends. His bio mentioned that he loved going on adventures, had a great sense of humor, and was looking for someone to experience life with. We exchanged messages for a couple of weeks before deciding to meet up. Our first date was pretty laid back. We grabbed drinks at a bar in Capitol Hill and everything seemed fine. Jason was charming and had this effortless way of making conversation, bouncing between topics like music, travel, and work. He told me he worked in tech, which wasn't surprising in Seattle. He made some sarcastic comments about the dating scene, and we laughed about the awkwardness of meeting people online. There were no red flags, nothing that made me question him. If anything, I was relieved to have met someone who seemed so normal after dealing with the usual mess on dating apps. After a couple of dates, Jason asked if I wanted to do a double date with his best friend Ryan, and said I should bring one of my friends along. He pitched it as a fun night out, grab some food, have some drinks, and just hang out. It didn't seem weird at the time, so I agreed. I asked my friend Sarah if she'd come along, and she was up for it. She wasn't seeing anyone at the time, so I thought it might be fun to set her up with Ryan. The night of the double date, we met up at a bar in Belltown. Jason introduced Ryan, and right away something about him was off. He was overly friendly, a little too eager, and just had this weird energy. I noticed it, but I didn't think much of it at first. Some people are just awkward, and I figured maybe he was just nervous about the whole double date thing. As the night went on, though, things got uncomfortable. Ryan was paying way too much attention to Sarah, constantly leaning in, asking her personal questions, and making little comments that were borderline inappropriate. He kept complimenting her in a way that felt off, like he was sizing her up rather than genuinely interested. Sarah shot me a few looks throughout the night, clearly uncomfortable, but we both tried to laugh it off. I figured maybe Ryan was just socially awkward and I didn't want to make a scene. At one point, Jason pulled me aside and said Ryan was a little intense, but a good guy overall, that he just had a hard time with women. He laughed it off, and again, I didn't think much of it. I didn't want to embarrass Sarah by making a big deal out of it, so we just powered through the rest of the night. By the time we left the bar, I could tell Sarah was over it. She pulled me aside and said Ryan was creeping her out, but she didn't want to ruin the night. I told her we could leave, but she insisted it was fine as long as we didn't hang out with Ryan again. We parted ways at the end of the night, and that was that, or so I thought. A couple of days later, Sarah called me, sounding more than a little freaked out. She said she had been getting strange messages from a number she didn't recognize, and they were clearly from Ryan. At first, they were just casual, like, "Hey, had a great time the other night, we should hang out again." But when Sarah didn't respond, The messages became more persistent, and then they started getting weird. Ryan began sending long, rambling texts about how he knew they had a connection and how it was fate that they met. Sarah hadn't given him her number, so it was obvious that Jason must have passed it on without asking her. She was furious, and honestly, I didn't blame her. I reached out to Jason asking why he had given Ryan her number, and he acted like it was no big deal. He said Ryan had really liked her and thought they might hit it off. When I told him that Ryan's messages were making Sarah uncomfortable, he brushed it off, saying Ryan was just being Ryan, and that she should give him a chance. That was when I started to get a bad feeling about the whole situation. I apologized to Sarah and told her I had no idea Jason had given Ryan her number. She decided to block Ryan, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The next day, Sarah got a message on Facebook from a profile with no picture and no real information, just the name Ryan. It was him again, asking why she had blocked his number and saying he was worried about her. Sarah blocked the profile immediately, but more messages kept coming from different accounts. It was like he wouldn't give up, creating new profiles to reach out to her, each message becoming more and more desperate. At this point, Sarah was scared, and so was I. I called Jason again, demanding he get Ryan to stop, but Jason acted like I was overreacting. He said Ryan was harmless, just a little obsessed, and that he'd cool off eventually. That was not the answer I wanted to hear, and I realized Jason wasn't going to help. I decided to cut things off with Jason, but before I could even send him a message to end it, he showed up at my apartment unannounced. I hadn't told him where I lived, so seeing him outside my building was unsettling. He acted like it was no big deal, said he was in the neighborhood and thought he'd drop by. I didn't let him in, but we talked through the door and I made it clear I didn't want to see him again. He tried to play it off, saying he didn't understand what the big deal was, that Ryan just liked Sarah and didn't know how to express it. When I refused to open the door, he finally left. But something about the way he smiled at me through the peephole stuck with me. It was unsettling, like he knew something I didn't. After that, things got worse. Sarah started getting anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. No one would say anything, but she could hear breathing on the other end. It happened almost every night, and she became paranoid, jumping at every noise outside her apartment. I told her to go to the police, but she didn't want to make a big deal out of it. We both tried to downplay what was happening, telling ourselves that it was just a guy who couldn't take a hint. But deep down, we were both scared. One night I came home late from work and found a note taped to my front door. It didn't say much, just that I should keep an eye on Sarah, and that Jason was looking out for me. The handwriting was shaky, almost manic, and I felt sick reading it. I hadn't heard from Jason since the day he showed up at my apartment, but it was clear he hadn't forgotten about me. I called Sarah right away and told her about the note, but before I could even finish, she said she had found something similar on her car earlier that day. The note on her car was more disturbing, though. It was from Ryan, saying he knew where she lived and worked and that they belonged together. At this point, we were both terrified. We went to the police, but they didn't seem to take it seriously. They said there wasn't much they could do unless something actually happened. We were told to block any more numbers or accounts and call if we felt threatened. It wasn't reassuring. The next week, Sarah came over to my place and we tried to figure out what to do next. We talked about getting restraining orders, but we didn't have enough evidence, and without knowing Ryan's full name or information, it felt like we were stuck. We had no way to really protect ourselves, and every day we waited, the anxiety built up. The last straw came one evening when Sarah called me in tears. She'd come home from work to find Ryan sitting outside her apartment building, waiting for her. He hadn't tried to approach her, just sat there on a bench watching as she got out of her car. She ran inside and locked her door, calling me in a panic. I told her to call the police, but by the time they arrived, Ryan was gone. That night, Sarah decided she couldn't stay in her apartment anymore. She packed a bag and left, staying with a friend on the other side of the city. I didn't blame her. I would have done the same. I hadn't heard from Jason again, but the fear that he or Ryan could show up at any moment had me constantly on edge. After Sarah left her apartment, The messages stopped, and we didn't hear from Ryan or Jason again. It was like they had vanished, and as relieved as we were, it was unsettling not knowing where they were or what they were planning. Sarah ended up moving away from Seattle altogether, and we both tried to move on, but the experience stayed with us. Every time I get a random text or see an unfamiliar number calling, my heart still races, wondering if it's one of them trying to worm their way back into my life.
I matched with Alex on Tinder about a year ago when I was living in Los Angeles. It started off normal enough. His profile wasn't anything out of the ordinary, and he seemed like a decent guy. He had pictures of him surfing, hiking, and hanging out with friends at some bar in Venice Beach. His bio mentioned that he was into photography and worked as a freelancer. Our conversations flowed easily, and he didn't come off too strong. He was funny, polite, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. After chatting for a couple of weeks, we decided to meet up for dinner. We went to a small restaurant in Santa Monica, and everything felt fine. He was charming, good-looking, and the conversation was easy. We talked about work, our favorite spots in LA, and our mutual love for outdoor activities. The date went well, and by the end of the night we agreed to see each other again. Over the next few weeks we hung out more, grabbing drinks, going for hikes, and even catching a movie. Everything felt like it was moving at a good pace. I liked him, and it seemed like he liked me too. He was attentive, always texting me to ask how my day was going, and he seemed genuinely interested in my life. I didn't notice anything off about him, and to be honest, I felt like things were heading in a good direction. But then, one night, I got a message from a random profile on Tinder. It was from a girl claiming to be Alex's ex-girlfriend, and she warned me to stay away from him. At first, I didn't believe it. I thought maybe it was someone messing with me, or maybe even some jealous ex trying to cause drama. The message was vague but unsettling. She didn't say much, just that Alex had a history of being controlling and that I should be careful. I brushed it off, but the seed of doubt was planted. A few days later, I asked Alex about it. I wasn't trying to accuse him of anything, but I wanted to see how he would react. When I brought it up, he got defensive right away. He didn't just brush it off like I expected, he got angry. He claimed his ex was crazy, that she had been stalking him for months, and that I shouldn't believe anything she said. His reaction was intense, way more than I expected. It made me uncomfortable, but I told myself maybe he was just frustrated with her. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I let it go. But after that, things started to change. Alex became more possessive, though it was subtle at first. He would ask me who I was with, what I was doing, and when I would be free. He started getting annoyed if I didn't respond to his texts right away or if I made plans without him. At first it seemed like he was just being attentive, but then it started to feel smothering. He'd call me multiple times a day, even if I was busy at work, and if I didn't answer, he'd blow up my phone with texts asking where I was. I tried to brush it off, but it started to wear on me. One night we were out at a bar, and I casually mentioned a guy I worked with in conversation. Alex's mood shifted immediately. He started asking a lot of questions. Who the guy was, how long I'd worked with him, if we ever hung out outside of work. His tone was harsh, and it caught me off guard. I told him it was nothing, just a coworker, but he wouldn't let it go. He kept pushing, saying I should be honest with him, and that he didn't want any secrets between us. I remember feeling uneasy, but I didn't know how to address it. I told myself maybe he was just insecure. Things escalated over the next few weeks. Alex started showing up at my apartment unannounced. At first it was kind of sweet. He'd say he was in the neighborhood and thought he'd surprise me. But it happened more often, and I started to feel like he was checking up on me. He'd show up when I was hanging out with friends, and I could tell he didn't like it. He'd make passive-aggressive comments about how much time I was spending with other people, and if I didn't invite him along, he'd get irritated. One night I went out with a few friends to a bar in downtown LA. I didn't tell Alex about it because I just wanted a night with my friends, no drama. But halfway through the night, he showed up. He hadn't texted me, hadn't called. He just appeared out of nowhere. He acted like it was no big deal, saying he thought he'd surprise me again. But I could feel the tension. He barely acknowledged my friends and kept trying to pull me away from the group.
when I finally told him I needed some space and wanted to hang out with my friends. He looked at me with this intensity that made my stomach drop. He didn't argue, but he stayed at the bar, watching me for the rest of the night. I felt trapped, unable to relax or enjoy myself. The next morning, I woke up to a series of texts from Alex, accusing me of flirting with other guys at the bar. He said he had seen the way I was talking to one of my friends and it made him uncomfortable. I tried to explain that it was just a friend, but he wouldn't listen. He kept going, saying I was disrespecting him by spending time with other people and not including him. I was exhausted from the argument and didn't know how to make him understand that he was being irrational. That's when I started to distance myself. I stopped responding to his texts as quickly and I didn't make plans to see him as often, but that only made things worse. Alex would show up at my apartment more frequently, asking why I wasn't answering his calls or why I didn't want to see him. He'd stand outside my door, knocking for what felt like forever, refusing to leave until I let him in. I started to feel trapped, like I couldn't escape him. One day I came home from work and something felt off. I noticed that things in my apartment had been moved, small things like my keys being in a different spot or the pillows on my couch being rearranged. I hadn't given Alex a key, but I started to wonder if he had somehow gotten into my apartment when I wasn't home. I asked him about it and he laughed it off, saying I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been in my space without my knowledge. A few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone knocking on my window. I lived on the second floor, so there was no way someone could just walk up to it. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, and when I looked out the window, I saw Alex standing in the alley below, staring up at me. He was calling my name, asking me to come down and talk to him. It was 2 a.m., and I had no idea how long he had been standing there. I didn't answer, just stood there frozen, watching him. He stayed for what felt like an eternity before finally walking away. The next morning, I told him we needed to take a break. I couldn't deal with the constant checking in, the possessiveness, and the feeling of being watched. He didn't take it well. He accused me of cheating on him, of lying about where I was going and who I was with. He said he was just trying to protect me and that I didn't appreciate everything he did for me. When I tried to reason with him, he got angry, saying I was throwing away something good for no reason. I blocked his number after that, hoping it would be the end of it. But it wasn't. A few days later, I started getting texts from an unknown number. They were clearly from Alex, even though he didn't say it outright. The messages were vague but unsettling, things like, "I know where you are," or "You can't hide from me." I blocked the number, but new ones kept popping up. He was relentless, and I felt like there was nothing I could do to make him stop. One night, I came home to find a note taped to my front door. It was from Alex, saying he missed me and that we needed to talk. The note felt like a threat, even though the words weren't overtly menacing. I didn't know what to do. I called a friend to come over and we talked about going to the police, but I didn't have enough evidence to prove he was harassing me. All I had were some texts and a note. It didn't feel like enough. For weeks, I lived in constant fear. I'd see him outside my building sometimes, just standing there watching. He never approached me, but I knew he was waiting for the right moment. I started changing my routine, taking different routes to work, avoiding places I used to go, and always looking over my shoulder. I felt like I couldn't escape him no matter what I did. Eventually, the texts stopped, and I didn't see him anymore. I don't know what made him finally give up, but the experience left me shaken. I moved to a new apartment a few months later, hoping to leave it all behind. But even now, I'm always on edge, waiting for the day when Alex might show up again, ready to pick up where he left off.